In the autumn of 1823, in a modest painting studio tucked along the muddy streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, two young women sat perfectly still as an artist captured their likeness on canvas. Margaret and Eleanor Whitmore, ages 19 and 17, wore their finest dresses for the occasion. Simple cotton gowns with high waists and long sleeves, typical of frontier fashion. Their faces were solemn, as was customary for portraits of that era, but there was something else in their expressions, something the artist couldn't quite name, a heaviness, a secret weight that pressed down on their shoulders even as they tried to sit upright and dignified. The painter, a traveling portraitist named Thomas Caldwell, had seen dozens of families pose for him during his journey westward from Philadelphia. He'd captured merchants and their wives, frontier preachers, young couples starting new lives on recently cleared land. But the Whitmore sisters were different. They didn't laugh or chat between sittings like other young women. They barely spoke at all. And there was that necklace. It hung between them, literally between them. A single gold chain with a small locket that rested in the space where their shoulders nearly touched. Each sister held one end of the chain delicately between her fingers, creating an impossible geometry. Margaret on the left, Eleanor on the right, and the locket suspended in the middle like a pendulum that had stopped swinging. Thomas had painted hundreds of portraits, but he'd never seen anyone wear jewelry like this. When he'd first asked about it, Margaret had simply said it was a family piece. Eleanor had said nothing at all, just stared past him toward the window where November rain streaked the glass. The Whitmore family had arrived in Cincinnati only 6 months earlier, part of the steady stream of settlers moving west from the crowded eastern states. Their father, Jonathan Whitmore, was a cabinet maker from Baltimore who'd heard there was opportunity in the growing river towns of Ohio. He'd purchased a small workshop near the public landing, where steamboats unloaded cargo and passengers daily. The work was good. The city was expanding. By all accounts, the Whitmores should have been thriving. But Thomas noticed things. The way Jonathan Whitmore's hands shook when he'd paid the deposit for the portrait. The way their mother, Catherine, had gripped her daughter's hands too tightly when she'd brought them to the studio for the first sitting. The way the girls themselves seemed to carry an invisible burden that aged them beyond their years. Margaret was the elder, and she bore the weight of responsibility with a quiet determination that showed in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze. She had dark hair pulled back severely from her face, and eyes that seemed to calculate every word before it left her lips. Eleanor was softer, rounder in the face, with lighter hair that escaped in small wisps around her temples, despite careful pinning. Where Margaret's expression was controlled, Eleanor's revealed everything: fear, sadness, resignation. The necklace connected them in the portrait, just as it connected them in life. Thomas had suggested gently that perhaps each sister might wear her own jewelry for the painting. Margaret had declined with a firmness that surprised him. This was how they wanted to be remembered, she'd said, together, sharing what they had. Cincinnati in 1823 was still rough around the edges, despite its growing population of nearly 10,000 souls. Pigs roamed the streets eating garbage. The smell from the slaughterhouses along the river sometimes made the air thick and unpleasant. But there was also music in the taverns, new buildings rising every month, and a sense that anything was possible in this western territory that had only recently been wrested from wilderness. The Whitmores lived in a modest 2-story house on 4th Street, within walking distance of the workshop. It was a decent neighborhood by frontier standards, with neighbors who nodded good morning and shopkeepers who extended reasonable credit. But Thomas had heard whispers. The way people stopped talking when the Whitmore name was mentioned. The quick glances and lowered voices. Something had happened to these sisters. Something that required them to share a necklace in a portrait, holding it between them like a promise or a prayer. And as Thomas mixed his paints and studied their faces in the grey afternoon light, he wondered what story that small gold locket could tell if it could speak. The portrait took 3 weeks to complete, 3 weeks of careful brush strokes and studied silence. Margaret and Eleanor came to the studio every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, always together, never alone. Their mother accompanied them initially, but after the first week, Catherine Whitmore stopped coming. She sent them with a servant instead, an older woman named Mrs. Yates, who waited outside the studio and asked no questions. During those sessions, Thomas learned small things about the sisters. Margaret liked to read, though books were expensive and hard to come by on the frontier. Eleanor had a gift for needlework and had already sold several pieces to a dry goods merchant on Main Street. Both girls helped their mother with household duties and occasionally assisted their father in the workshop, keeping his accounts and organizing his orders. But he learned nothing about the necklace. Every time he approached the subject, even indirectly, the conversation would shift. Margaret would ask about his travels. Eleanor would comment on the weather. The necklace remained a mystery, suspended between them in gold and silence. Cincinnati's social circles were small and interconnected. Information traveled quickly through parlors and over tea tables. Thomas lodged at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, and she proved to be a reliable source of local knowledge. Over supper one evening, he mentioned that he was painting the Whitmore sisters. Mrs. Fletcher's expression changed immediately. She set down her fork with unusual care and glanced around the dining room to see who might be listening. Then she leaned forward and spoke in a low voice that barely carried across the table. The Whitmores, she explained, had left Baltimore under difficult circumstances. There had been an engagement. A young man named Robert Thorne, son of a prominent shipping merchant. He'd been courting Margaret for nearly a year, and everyone expected an announcement of their betrothal. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. Robert Thorne had died in June of 1823, just before the Whitmores departed for Ohio. The official cause was a fever, but there were rumors, whispers about a dispute, about harsh words spoken in anger, about a young man who'd taken ill so suddenly that some questioned whether illness alone could explain his rapid decline. Margaret had been devastated. For weeks she'd refused to leave her room. She'd stopped eating, stopped speaking, had stopped engaging with the world in any meaningful way. It was Eleanor who'd brought her back, sitting with her hour after hour, holding her hand, sharing her grief. The sisters had always been close, but Robert's death had forged something stronger between them, something unbreakable. The necklace had belonged to their grandmother, Mrs. Fletcher continued. It had been given to Margaret on her 16th birthday, with the understanding that she would pass it to her own daughter someday. But after Robert died, Margaret had insisted that Eleanor share it. She'd had a jeweler add length to the chain so both sisters could wear it simultaneously. They'd worn it that way ever since, a symbol of their bond, their shared sorrow, their refusal to be separated. Thomas listened carefully, his mind filling in details that Mrs. Fletcher's story suggested, but didn't explicitly state. A broken engagement, a sudden death, a family fleeing east to west as if pursued by something more than simple economic opportunity, and two sisters bound together not just by blood, but by something darker and more complex. The following Tuesday, when Margaret and Eleanor returned for their sitting, Thomas observed them with new eyes. He noticed how Margaret's hand trembled slightly when she positioned the necklace. He saw how Eleanor's gaze drifted to her sister's face whenever Thomas wasn't looking, as if checking to make sure Margaret was still there, still breathing, still present. The rain had returned, drumming steadily on the studio roof. The light was poor, but Thomas worked anyway, adding shadows to the background, deepening the contrast between the sisters' pale faces and the darkness behind them. He wanted to capture not just their physical appearance, but the weight of what they carried, the grief, the guilt, the desperate love that held them together. By mid-November, the portrait was nearly finished. Thomas had captured the sisters with remarkable accuracy. The set of Margaret's shoulders, the softness of Eleanor's features, the way they both held the necklace as if it were made of something more precious than gold. But he felt there was still something missing, some essential truth that the paint hadn't yet revealed. He began asking more direct questions. Margaret answered with measured politeness. Yes, they missed Baltimore. No, they didn't regret coming to Cincinnati. Yes, their father's business was doing well. No, they didn't know when they might visit the East again. Eleanor said almost nothing. She simply sat, her fingers touching the necklace chain, her eyes focused on some point beyond the studio walls. Sometimes Thomas caught her crying silently, tears sliding down her cheeks without sound or obvious emotion. Margaret would notice and reach for her sister's hand, squeezing gently, and Eleanor would compose herself and continue sitting as if nothing had happened. The truth emerged slowly, piece by piece, like a portrait coming into focus. It started with a comment from Jonathan Whitmore, who stopped by the studio one afternoon to check on the painting's progress. He stood before the canvas for a long time, studying his daughter's painted faces with an expression that mixed pride and deep sadness. "Robert Thorne had been a good man," Jonathan said quietly. "He'd loved Margaret sincerely, he would have made a fine husband. But he'd also been impulsive and passionate, quick to anger when he felt wronged. And when Margaret had expressed doubts about their engagement, not a rejection, just uncertainty about timing, about moving so quickly, Robert had reacted badly. He'd accused her of leading him on, of accepting his attention while harboring feelings for someone else. The argument had been public, in a Baltimore park where dozens of people could hear every bitter word. Margaret had been humiliated. Robert had been furious. They'd parted ways with harsh finality. 3 days later, Robert had fallen ill. A fever, the doctors said. It had come on suddenly and progressed rapidly. Within a week he was dead, and Margaret, already devastated by their quarrel, had been consumed by guilt. She blamed herself for his death, convinced that the stress of their argument had somehow weakened him, made him vulnerable to illness. Jonathan paused, his hand resting on the back of a chair, his knuckles white with pressure. "Eleanor had saved Margaret's life," he said, not figuratively, literally. Margaret had tried to harm herself in the depths of her grief, and Eleanor had found her, stopped her, refused to leave her side for weeks afterward. That's when they'd started sharing the necklace. Eleanor's idea, originally, a way to keep them physically connected, to make it impossible for Margaret to slip away into darkness without Eleanor knowing. What had started as a desperate measure had become something deeper, a symbol of their interdependence, their shared survival, their determination to carry each other through whatever came next. The move to Cincinnati had been Jonathan's attempt to give his daughters a fresh start, away from Baltimore's gossip and painful memories, away from the Thorne family, who had made it clear they blamed Margaret for Robert's death, away from everything familiar into the uncertain promise of the Western Territories. Thomas finished the portrait the following week. In the final painting, the necklace gleamed between the sisters like a thread of light connecting two souls. Their faces were serious, but not broken. Their postures suggested strength, not fragility. And in the subtle positioning of their hands, in the way their shoulders almost touched, Thomas had captured something essential about their bond, the way they held each other up, the way they refused to let go. When the Whitmores came to collect the finished portrait, Catherine wept. Jonathan stood silent, his jaw working as he fought to control his emotions. Margaret studied the painting with critical eyes, then nodded slowly. Eleanor simply reached for her sister's hand and held it tightly. Thomas wrapped the portrait carefully in cloth and helped Jonathan load it into their wagon. As the family prepared to leave, Eleanor turned back to him. "Thank you," she said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to him in 3 weeks. "You saw us truly." Margaret added nothing, but her expression held a quiet gratitude that needed no words. Then they were gone, rattling away down the muddy street toward 4th Street and home. Thomas Caldwell left Cincinnati in early December, continuing his westward journey toward Louisville and eventually St. Louis. The Whitmore portrait remained with him in memory, not because of its technical merit, though he was satisfied with the work, but because of what it represented. 2 young women bound together by tragedy and love, wearing their grief like jewelry, refusing to be separated even in art. For the Whitmore family, life in Cincinnati continued its uncertain course. Jonathan's cabinet-making business grew steadily. He hired 2 apprentices to help with the increasing orders for furniture, storage chests and coffins. The workshop became known for quality craftsmanship and fair prices. Money, at least, was no longer a pressing concern, but the portrait hung in their parlor like a mirror reflecting truths the family rarely spoke aloud. Visitors would comment on it, compliment the artist's skill, ask about the unusual necklace. Catherine learned to deflect these questions with practiced ease. Margaret would offer vague explanations about family tradition. Eleanor would excuse herself and leave the room. The necklace itself remained a constant presence in the sisters' lives. They wore it every day, adjusting the length so both could move freely while remaining connected. At night, they slept in the same bed despite having separate rooms, the necklace carefully placed on the nightstand between them where both could see it. Margaret had begun teaching at a small school that had opened on Vine Street. She was good with children, patient and clear in her explanations. The work gave her purpose and kept her mind occupied. But she still woke sometimes in the night, gasping from dreams where Robert Thorne stood before her, his face pale and accusatory, demanding to know why she'd killed him. Eleanor would wake too, alerted by her sister's distress. She'd light a candle, and they'd sit together in the darkness, saying little, simply being present for each other. Eleanor's needlework business had expanded. She'd taken on 2 students and was considering opening a small shop. But her real work was Margaret, keeping her sister anchored, keeping her alive, keeping her moving forward. Winter settled over Cincinnati with unusual severity. The Ohio River froze solid enough to walk across. Snow piled in drifts against buildings and made the streets nearly impassable. The Whitmores stayed close to home during the worst weeks, Jonathan working in his heated workshop, the women doing household tasks and their respective work indoors. It was during this frozen January that a letter arrived from Baltimore. Catherine recognized the handwriting immediately, Robert Thorne's mother, Elizabeth. Her hands shook as she broke the seal and read the contents. Then she called her daughters into the parlor and handed Margaret the letter. Elizabeth Thorne had written to apologize. Not for blaming Margaret initially, grief had made her irrational, she admitted, but for allowing that blame to drive the Whitmores from Baltimore. She'd learned things since Robert's death, from his personal physician, from his closest friend, from his own diary, discovered among his belongings. Robert had been ill for months before the argument with Margaret, a weakness in his heart that he'd kept hidden, fearing it would ruin his prospects for marriage and business. The argument hadn't caused his death. The fever had simply revealed what was already failing. He would have died regardless of what words were spoken in the park that day. Elizabeth's letter was long and detailed, explaining medical consultations and anatomical findings that confirmed Robert's underlying condition. She wanted Margaret to know, needed Margaret to know, that she bore no responsibility for his death. That guilt was unnecessary and undeserved, that she hoped Margaret would find peace and happiness in her new life. The letter ended with a request. If Margaret could find it in her heart to write back, just a brief note acknowledging receipt of the letter, Elizabeth would be grateful. She didn't expect forgiveness. She simply wanted to know that her words had reached their intended recipient. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her face expressionless. Then she handed it to Eleanor, who read it with tears streaming down her face. Catherine watched both daughters carefully, uncertain how this news would affect them. The silence stretched for several minutes. Outside, wind rattled the windows and drove snow against the glass. Finally, Margaret stood and walked to the writing desk in the corner. She pulled out paper and ink and began composing a response to Elizabeth Thorne. Margaret's letter to Elizabeth Thorne was brief but sincere. She thanked her for the medical information and for taking the time to write. She acknowledged that the news brought some measure of relief, though grief and regret couldn't be erased by facts alone. She wished Elizabeth peace and closed with formal politeness that suggested doors weren't entirely closed, but weren't fully open either. Eleanor watched her sister write, seal, and address the letter with a mixture of hope and concern. The guilt had become so fundamental to Margaret's identity over the past months that Eleanor worried what would happen if that burden was suddenly lifted. Would Margaret find freedom, or would she feel lost without the familiar weight of responsibility for Robert's death? The letter was posted the next day. Life continued its rhythms. Margaret taught her students. Eleanor worked on her needlework commissions. Jonathan built furniture. Catherine managed the household. And the necklace remained constant, linking the sisters through waking hours and sleeping ones. But something had shifted. Margaret began sleeping through the night without nightmares. Her appetite improved. She laughed occasionally at something Eleanor said, small, genuine moments of lightness that had been absent since Baltimore. The shadows under her eyes gradually faded. Eleanor noticed these changes with cautious optimism. She didn't mention them directly, fearing that calling attention to improvement might somehow reverse it. Instead, she simply remained present, available, connected through gold chain and sisterly devotion. Spring arrived with sudden force in late March. The river ice broke with sounds like cannon fire, huge chunks grinding downstream toward the Mississippi. Trees budded overnight, mud replaced snow in the streets, and Cincinnati emerged from winter isolation with renewed energy. Margaret suggested they might consider separate bedrooms again. "Just to try it," she said carefully, watching Eleanor's reaction. The necklace would remain, of course. They'd still wear it during the day, but perhaps sleeping apart might allow them both more restful nights. Eleanor agreed, though anxiety tightened her chest. That night, she lay alone in her room, the necklace coiled on her nightstand, and listened to every sound from Margaret's room next door. She didn't sleep until she heard her sister's steady breathing through the thin wall, confirming that Margaret was safe, alive, still present. They maintained this arrangement for a week before Eleanor admitted she couldn't sustain it. The anxiety was too great. Margaret, surprisingly, confessed similar feelings. They'd become so accustomed to each other's presence that separation felt wrong, incomplete. They returned to sharing a bed with mutual relief. Jonathan's business received an unusual commission in April. A wealthy merchant named Harrison Caldwell, no relation to the portraitist, wanted an elaborate china cabinet for his new house on 3rd Street. The piece would require intricate joinery and carved details that would take weeks to complete. He was willing to pay handsomely for quality work. Jonathan accepted the commission and threw himself into the project with intense focus. He worked late into evenings, designing and redesigning until the plans satisfied his exacting standards. Margaret and Eleanor often brought him dinner at the workshop, and he'd show them his progress, explaining how different woods behaved under tools, how joints needed to be cut precisely for strength and beauty. One evening, as Jonathan demonstrated a particular carving technique, he mentioned that Harrison Caldwell had a son. William Caldwell recently returned from 2 years studying law in Philadelphia. Young, unmarried, apparently quite intelligent. Harrison had mentioned during negotiations that William might benefit from meeting educated young women who could appreciate civilized conversation. Margaret understood immediately what her father was suggesting. She set down the plate she'd been holding with deliberate care and met Jonathan's eyes directly. She appreciated his concern for her future, she said quietly, but she wasn't ready to consider courtship, might never be ready. She hoped he would understand and not press the matter. Jonathan nodded slowly. He wouldn't push, he promised, but the invitation was extended if she ever changed her mind. Life moved forward, whether one was ready or not. Eleanor said nothing, but her hand found Margaret's under the table and held it tightly, silently communicating support and solidarity. Summer brought heat and humidity that made Cincinnati feel tropical. The river smelled ripe with commerce and sewage. Mosquitoes bred in standing water, and doctors warned about fever season approaching. The Whitmores, like most families who could afford it, took precautions: window screens, careful attention to water sources, avoidance of the crowded riverfront during evening hours, when bad air was thought to be most dangerous. Margaret's school closed for summer months, giving her time for other pursuits. She'd begun volunteering at the city's small lending library, cataloging books and helping patrons find materials. The work brought her into contact with Cincinnati's small educated class: lawyers, clergymen, merchants' wives who valued learning. She found unexpected satisfaction in these interactions, discovering that she could engage with people without the constant weight of Baltimore's tragedy defining every conversation. Eleanor's needlework business continued to grow. She'd hired a 3rd student and was considering renting a small storefront where she could display finished pieces and meet with clients. Catherine encouraged this expansion, seeing in Eleanor's entrepreneurial spirit something worth nurturing. Women rarely owned businesses in 1823, but frontier towns offered opportunities that eastern cities did not. The necklace remained their constant companion. They'd grown so accustomed to wearing it that its presence felt natural, unremarkable. Strangers still asked about it occasionally, but the sisters had developed practiced responses that satisfied curiosity without revealing deeper truths. In July, Harrison Caldwell's china cabinet was completed. It was Jonathan's masterwork, 6 feet tall, with glass-fronted doors, carved columns and precisely fitted drawers that glided soundlessly on wooden runners. When Harrison came to inspect the finished piece, he brought his son, William. William Caldwell was 24, tall and lean, with dark hair and observant eyes that took in details without appearing to stare. He examined the cabinet with genuine appreciation, understanding the craftsmanship required for such work. Then he noticed the portrait hanging on the workshop wall. Thomas Caldwell had left it there temporarily, while the Whitmore's parlor was being repainted. The portrait of the sisters caught William's attention immediately. He stood before it for several minutes, studying the composition, the unusual necklace, the expressions on their faces. When Jonathan introduced Margaret and Eleanor, who'd arrived to help inventory some supplies, William's interest visibly sharpened. He asked intelligent questions about the portrait: who had painted it, when, what had prompted the commission. Margaret answered politely but without elaboration. Eleanor remained silent, as was her habit with strangers, but William seemed genuinely interested, rather than merely curious, and his manner was respectful rather than intrusive. Harrison invited the Whitmores to dinner the following week. A social courtesy, he explained, to celebrate the successful completion of the cabinet and to thank Jonathan for exceptional work. Catherine accepted graciously, and the sisters agreed to attend, despite Margaret's reservations. The Caldwell house was impressive by Cincinnati standards: two-story brick construction with proper glass windows and a parlor furnished with pieces that had clearly been brought west at considerable expense. Dinner was served in a formal dining room, and conversation ranged across politics, literature, and the city's rapid growth. William addressed most of his comments to Margaret, clearly intrigued by her work at the library and her obvious education. He'd read many of the same books she mentioned, and they discovered shared opinions about various authors and philosophical questions. Eleanor watched this interaction carefully, alert for any sign that her sister was uncomfortable or overwhelmed. But Margaret seemed unexpectedly at ease. She debated with William about whether Western settlement represented progress or destruction, holding her own against his legal training and rhetorical skill. Her cheeks flushed with the animation of genuine intellectual engagement rather than distress. After dinner, as Catherine and Harrison discussed household matters, William asked the sisters about their unusual necklace. The question was gentle, inviting explanation rather than demanding it. Margaret glanced at Eleanor, who gave a slight nod of permission. Margaret explained that they'd shared the necklace after experiencing a personal loss, that it represented their bond as sisters and their commitment to supporting each other through difficult times. She didn't mention Robert Thorne by name or provide details about Baltimore. William listened attentively and simply said he found it a beautiful symbol of sisterly devotion. The evening ended with mutual expressions of pleasure at new acquaintance. As the Whitmores departed, William asked if he might call on them sometime. Margaret hesitated, then agreed with careful formality that he would be welcome to visit. William Caldwell began visiting the Whitmore household regularly. He came on Sunday afternoons, properly chaperoned, and engaged in conversation with the entire family rather than focusing exclusively on Margaret. This approach seemed calculated to put everyone at ease, and it worked. Even Eleanor, usually wary of strangers, found herself appreciating William's thoughtful manner and genuine interest in others' perspectives. Margaret maintained careful distance despite growing comfortable with William's presence. She participated in conversations about books and current events, but deflected any topics that verged toward personal history or future possibilities. The necklace remained visible, a constant reminder of commitments and connections that predated William's arrival in their lives. William never asked directly about Margaret's past, though his father had surely heard rumors. Cincinnati's social circles were too small for complete secrets, but William demonstrated remarkable patience, content to build friendship slowly without rushing toward anything deeper. In August, William invited the Whitmore family to a musical evening at his father's house. A traveling pianist from New York would perform, and several prominent families would attend. Margaret initially declined, citing previous commitments, but Eleanor surprisingly encouraged her to reconsider. The music would be exceptional, Eleanor argued, and it would be good for Margaret to experience joy without guilt. Margaret looked at her sister with sudden understanding. Eleanor was giving permission, perhaps even encouragement, for Margaret to engage with life beyond their shared grief. The realization brought tears to Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away and agreed to attend. The musical evening exceeded expectations. The pianist was brilliant, performing pieces by Mozart and Beethoven with technical mastery and emotional depth. Margaret found herself transported by the music, feeling emotions she'd suppressed for more than a year. When the performance ended, she realized William had been watching her rather than the pianist, observing her reactions with quiet attention. They spoke afterward, standing by tall windows that overlooked the darkened street. William mentioned that music had the power to reach places that words couldn't touch. Margaret agreed, then surprised herself by mentioning Robert Thorne's name for the first time in William's presence. She explained briefly about the engagement and argument, about Robert's death and her guilt, about the move to Cincinnati and the shared necklace. William listened without interruption, his expression grave but not shocked. When she finished, he thanked her for trusting him with the truth. He understood now why she wore the necklace with Eleanor, he said, and why she might be reluctant to consider new attachments. He respected both completely, but he hoped she would permit him to continue their friendship, with no expectations beyond mutual regard and intellectual companionship. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully recognized until it began to release. She agreed to continued friendship, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Eleanor observed these developments with mixed feelings. She was genuinely happy to see Margaret engaging with life again, finding pleasure in music and conversation and ideas. But she also felt the first stirrings of something she'd never expected to experience, the possibility of separation. Not immediately, perhaps not for years, but eventually, if Margaret's feelings for William deepened, Eleanor would need to release her sister to a different kind of bond. The thought terrified her. The necklace had become so essential to her sense of security that imagining life without it seemed impossible. Yet she loved Margaret too much to hold her back from happiness. The contradiction created an internal struggle that Eleanor worked to hide even from her sister. As summer faded into autumn, William's visits continued their regular pattern. He and Margaret maintained careful friendship, discussing books and arguing about politics, and sharing observations about Cincinnati's rapid transformation. Eleanor participated in these conversations when invited, but increasingly found herself watching rather than engaging. One evening in late September, after William had departed, Eleanor suggested they might consider altering the necklace again, perhaps making it possible for them to remove it occasionally, she said carefully. Not permanently, just for special occasions when one sister might need independence. Margaret studied Eleanor's face, understanding immediately what her sister was really saying. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. They would take small steps, she said, test possibilities, see what felt right. They took the necklace to a jeweler the following week and had clasps added to both ends of the chain. Now each sister could remove her side independently if needed, though they could still wear it connected when they chose. The modified necklace represented more than mechanical convenience. It symbolized Eleanor's recognition that Margaret might need freedom to explore a future that didn't revolve entirely around shared grief and mutual protection. Margaret understood the sacrifice this represented and loved her sister even more deeply for making it. William proposed marriage to Margaret in December of 1824, more than a year after they'd first met. He did so formally with her father's permission and in the Whitmore parlor with the family present. He acknowledged Margaret's past, her ongoing bond with Eleanor, and his understanding that marriage would need to accommodate the sisters' extraordinary closeness. He promised patience, respect, and devotion without demanding she forget or minimize what she'd experienced. Margaret asked for time to consider. William agreed immediately and left to allow the family privacy. Margaret then turned to Eleanor, searching her sister's face for genuine reaction rather than performed acceptance. Eleanor smiled, though tears gathered in her eyes. She told Margaret to accept the proposal. William was a good man who understood what Margaret needed. He would honor her past while helping create a future, and Eleanor would be nearby, not in the same house perhaps, but close enough to maintain connection and support. Catherine and Jonathan added their encouragement. They'd grown fond of William and trusted his intentions. This was a second chance Margaret deserved, a possibility of happiness that shouldn't be refused out of fear or excessive loyalty to the past. Margaret accepted William's proposal the following day. They would marry in spring, after a proper engagement period that would give everyone time to adjust to changing circumstances. William agreed to all of Margaret's conditions, including Eleanor's prominent role in their lives and the continued significance of the shared necklace. The engagement brought genuine joy to the Whitmore household. Plans were made, trousseau items were sewn, and William integrated himself further into the family's daily rhythms. He treated Eleanor with brotherly affection and respect, never suggesting that Margaret's bond with her sister was excessive or problematic. Eleanor opened her needlework shop in January, renting a small storefront on Main Street. The business provided her with purpose and identity beyond being Margaret's protector. She discovered she enjoyed the independence and the challenge of running an enterprise. Catherine helped with initial setup, and Margaret visited daily until the wedding approached, and other preparations demanded attention. The wedding took place in May of 1825, in a simple ceremony at the Presbyterian Church on 4th Street. Eleanor stood beside Margaret as they'd always stood, connected, supportive, present. But when William placed his ring on Margaret's finger, Eleanor felt the weight of change settling into reality. Margaret moved into the Caldwell house after the wedding. Though she visited Eleanor daily, they still wore the necklace frequently, connecting themselves by choice rather than desperate necessity. But they also experimented with independence, testing their ability to function separately while maintaining their profound bond. Eleanor discovered she could sleep alone without panic. Margaret found she could experience happiness without overwhelming guilt. They both learned that love didn't require constant physical proximity to remain strong and true. William proved to be exactly what he'd promised: patient, understanding, respectful of Margaret's complicated history and ongoing needs. He encouraged her relationship with Eleanor and never suggested competing for primary place in Margaret's heart. He simply created space for himself alongside existing bonds rather than demanding they be diminished. The portrait remained in the Whitmore parlor, then eventually moved to Eleanor's quarters above her shop. It hung there for decades, showing two young women connected by gold and sorrow and love that transcended simple categories. The necklace itself was eventually divided, each sister keeping one half after Eleanor married several years later. But they had both sides mounted in frames that hung in their respective homes, visual reminders of a bond that had saved both their lives. Margaret and William had 4 children. Eleanor had 3. The cousins grew up together, hearing stories about the necklace and the portrait and the year when everything seemed darkest. They learned that love sometimes requires holding tight and sometimes requires letting go, and that the strongest bonds are those flexible enough to accommodate growth and change. Cincinnati continued growing around them, transforming from frontier town to substantial city. The Whitmores and Caldwells became respected families within that community, known for integrity and quiet devotion to each other. The portrait Thomas Caldwell had painted in 1823 became a family treasure, passed through generations, always accompanied by the story of 2 sisters who'd worn one necklace and survived what might have destroyed them separately. And the necklace itself, divided but never truly separate, remained a symbol of something essential about human connection: the way we hold each other through darkness, the way we give each other permission to find light, and the way true love adapts to whatever forms life requires. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.